Right now, 8 prisoners across America are counting down their final days. Some will face lethal injection, others will breathe their last breath through nitrogen gas, and in Utah, one man will stand before a firing squad, the first in years. These aren't distant cases. These executions are already scheduled for 2025 and 2026, and their stories reveal the darkest side of crime and punishment in the United States. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll stay updated on every new story we bring you about death row, last meals, and final words. Curtis Lee Wyndham. Curtis Lee Wyndham, then determined by a sense of betrayal and a debt he believed he was owed, takes center stage. He'd been told his acquaintance, Johnny Lee, owed him $2,000, a sum that weighed heavily on Wyndham's mind. What infuriated him most, Lee had just won $140 at a Greyhound racetrack. Fueled by rage, Wyndham ominously declared, "You're gonna read about me." Moments later, armed with a .38 caliber revolver and a box of 50 rounds, purchased at a nearby Walmart, he drove through the streets on a mission that would become a tragedy. Wyndham pulled up beside Lee, firing twice into his back. Then, stepping over the crime scene, he let 2 more bullets ring out at close range. A cold execution without a word. But his terror didn't end there. He raced to the apartment of Valerie Davis, a woman he once loved and the mother of his child. Without warning, he shot her in front of a friend. Davis fell, lifeless, no motive, no provocation. As chaos unfolded, another man became a victim, his wound a random act of violence as Wyndham fled. Then, as if fate guided his path, Wyndham encountered Mary Lubin, Valerie's mother. She had just left work and was driving to her daughter's apartment. At a stop sign, Wyndham approached and shot her twice through the window. Lubin never made it alive. Now fast forward to August 2025. Curtis Wyndham, 59 years old, stands on death row in Florida State Prison. The state has scheduled him to be executed by lethal injection on August 28, 2025, the 11th execution in Florida this year, a grim record in the modern era. His appeals have run out. Both the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to halt the execution. His attorneys argued that his trial representation was ineffective, that his lawyer failed to present crucial evidence of mental illness, brain damage, or intellectual disabilities. Those claims were aimed at invoking evolving standards of decency and highlighting long overlooked mitigating factors. But the courts remained unpersuaded. Valerie Davis and Mary Lubin were more than names. They were part of a family shattered by loss. Valerie's daughter, Curticia, now grown, has publicly opposed her father's execution. "We've all been traumatized," she says quietly, urging forgiveness even as anger still echoes. It hurt a lot, but if we could forgive him, I don't see why people on the street have a right to say he should die. In the course of one fateful afternoon in 1992, 3 lives were extinguished. Johnny Lee over a debt, Valerie Davis with no warning, Mary Lubin in the wrong place at the wrong time. Curtis Wyndham's path led from theft and obsession to execution. Now, all attention turns to August 28, 2025, when he will become one of the first names in this year's death row lineup, a ripple from history, soon to reach its final conclusion. Ralph Leroy Menzies. The story of Ralph Leroy Menzies begins nearly 4 decades ago, back in February 1986. Utah was gripped by winter cold, but what unfolded would chill the community for years to come. Menzies, then a 25-year-old man with a history of crime and instability, set his sights on Maureen Hunsaker, a 26-year-old wife and mother of 3. Maureen had stopped at a 7-Eleven convenience store in Kearns, Utah, to buy a soft drink. It was supposed to be an ordinary errand. Instead, it was the beginning of her last moments on Earth. Witnesses later testified that Menzies, armed and desperate, forced Maureen into his car at knife point. From there, he drove her up a mountain road into Big Cottonwood Canyon, a rugged area outside Salt Lake City. What followed was hours of captivity, threats, and ultimately death. Prosecutors said Menzies tied Maureen to a tree with rope and strangled her with his own belt. Her body was found later in the canyon, still bound. The brutality shocked the state. An innocent woman, randomly taken, tortured, and discarded in the mountains. In 1988, a jury convicted Ralph Leroy Menzies of capital murder, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. he was sentenced to death. But like so many death row cases, the punishment would be delayed for decades through appeals, retrials, and procedural battles. Over the years, his lawyers raised claims about his mental health, the fairness of the trial, and the evolving standards of punishment. Each appeal was eventually denied. By 2025, 39 years had passed since Maureen's murder, and Menzies remained on Utah's death row, the longest-serving inmate in the state. But what makes this case stand out is not just the crime. It's the method of execution. Menzies has chosen to die by firing squad, a method rarely used in modern America but still permitted under Utah law. Since lethal injection drugs have become increasingly difficult to obtain, Utah remains one of the few states where firing squad is a legal alternative. If carried out, September 5th to 2025 could mark the first firing squad execution in the United States in over a decade. The image itself is chilling. A man, strapped to a chair, a target placed over his heart, facing 5 volunteer marksmen armed with rifles. One rifle contains a blank round, so no shooter knows who fired the fatal shot. For Maureen's family, the wait for justice has stretched across generations. Her children grew up without their mother, and now they prepare to watch the man responsible for her death finally face his sentence. For Menzies, now in his 60s, the day of reckoning is near. After decades of appeals and a lifetime on death row, the countdown has begun. David Joseph Pittman. The year was 1990, and in Polk County, Florida, a brutal crime would leave a lasting scar on 2 families. At the center of it all was David Joseph Pittman, then a young man with a troubled past and a storm of jealousy brewing inside him. His former girlfriend, Maria Cecilia Zdeno, had moved on from their relationship. She was living with her roommate, Patricia Patty Pete, in a Lakeland apartment. For most, it was an ordinary life, a chance at stability and independence. But for Pittman, consumed by anger and obsession, it was an ending he could not accept. On the night of June 13, 1990, Pittman entered their home. What followed was a scene of sheer violence. Both women were stabbed repeatedly. Maria stabbed 36 times, Patty stabbed 32 times. The attacks were so vicious that detectives later described them as acts of pure rage, not just murder. Blood was found smeared across the walls, the floor, and even on Pittman himself when he was questioned. Prosecutors said the evidence was overwhelming. This was not a random act, but a deliberate, targeted attack against the women he blamed for his broken pride and rejection. In 1996, a Florida jury convicted David Joseph Pittman of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They sentenced him to death. For more than 3 decades since that verdict, Pittman has lived on death row at Florida State Prison, appealing his conviction and sentence again and again. Over the years, his legal team has argued about ineffective counsel, improper handling of evidence, and questions of his mental health, but each appeal has been rejected. Courts at both the state and federal level upheld the sentence, leaving only one outcome: execution. Now the date has been set. On September 17, 2025, Pittman is scheduled to die by lethal injection. At 59 years old, he is nearing the end of a long and exhausting legal battle. What makes his case stand out is not just the brutality of the crime, but also its timing. Florida has already carried out a record number of executions in 2025. Pittman's death will add to that total, showing the state's determination to enforce capital punishment, despite ongoing national debates about its morality and effectiveness. For the families of Maria Zdeno and Patricia Pete, the decades have been filled with grief, waiting, and the painful reminder of what was stolen from them in 1990. For Pittman, the countdown is almost over. Jeffrey Todd West. The crime that sealed Jeffrey Todd West's fate happened more than 2 decades ago in the small town of Cullman, Alabama. It was 1999, a night when an ordinary home became the scene of unspeakable terror. West, then just 23 years old, broke into the house of Clarence and Barbara Terry. Inside, the couple and their family friend David Roberts were caught in the middle of his violent rampage. West carried with him not only a gun, but also a reckless determination. That night, 3 lives were brutally ended. Clarence Terry, his wife Barbara, and David Roberts were all shot to death inside the Terry home. The motive, prosecutors said, was simple and chilling: robbery fueled by desperation and disregard for human life. The community was horrified. A respected couple and their friend gone in a matter of moments, their family shattered, their neighborhood left in shock. In the trial that followed, West was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder. The jury heard the details of the killings, the planning, the break-in, and the cold-blooded executions. They sentenced him to death. For years, West remained on death row, filing appeals and petitions, trying to overturn or delay the sentence. But by 2025, every appeal had been denied. The court stood firm. Jeffrey Todd West would face execution. But what sets his case apart is not just the crime, it's the method the state has chosen to carry it out. West is scheduled to die by nitrogen hypoxia, a controversial execution method that Alabama has only recently begun to use. The process involves strapping a mask over the inmate's face and replacing oxygen with nitrogen gas, causing death by suffocation. Supporters argue it is painless. Critics, however, call it cruel, experimental, and untested on humans. In January 2024, Alabama carried out the first ever nitrogen hypoxia execution on inmate Kenneth Smith. Reports from witnesses described it as deeply troubling. Smith shook and gasped for air for several minutes before dying. With West's case, Alabama is preparing to use this method again, and the world will be watching closely. For the families of Clarence and Barbara Terry and David Roberts, the date of September 25, 2025, will bring the justice they have waited decades to see. For others, it will reignite debate over whether nitrogen gas represents progress or simply another cruel chapter in America's history of capital punishment. Either way, Jeffrey Todd West's execution will not pass quietly. It will draw national attention as Alabama continues to test a method unlike any other in the modern death penalty era. Antonio Sanchez Franklin. The year was 1997 in Ohio. A robbery turned deadly, leaving behind not only stolen goods, but also 2 lives cut short. At the center of it all was Antonio Sanchez Franklin, a man whose choices that night would alter his fate forever. According to prosecutors, Franklin entered a home intending to rob it. But the crime spiraled into violence. 2 people, innocent victims caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, were murdered. Their names became the silent testimony to the brutality of Franklin's act. The details revealed in court were grim. Franklin had not only taken property, he had taken life. For the families of the victims, the losses were immediate, devastating, and permanent. Franklin was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted of double murder during the course of a robbery. The jury heard the evidence and in the end sentenced him to death. Since then, Franklin has spent nearly 3 decades on Ohio's death row. His appeals have followed the familiar path of many capital cases: claims of ineffective assistance, constitutional challenges, questions about his background and upbringing. But none were enough to overturn his conviction or his sentence. Now, time is running out. On February 11, 2026, Franklin is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection. He will be the first inmate put to death in Ohio that year, marking the beginning of a grim calendar of executions the state has already set in motion. For Franklin, the long years of waiting have dwindled down to months, then weeks, and soon, days. The story of Antonio Sanchez Franklin underscores the harsh reality of capital punishment in America. For the families of the victims, his execution represents long-awaited justice. For others, it raises the same old questions about whether the death penalty truly heals the wounds it leaves behind. What remains certain is this: on February 11, 2026, Franklin will be led into Ohio's death chamber. A needle will deliver the state's final judgment, and with it, his story will come to a close. James Earl Trimble. The year was 2005 in Stark County, Ohio. What began as a night of domestic violence turned into one of the most shocking crimes in the state's history, leaving not 1, but 3 victims dead, including a child. At the center of the tragedy was James Earl Trimble, a man whose rage and control spiraled into cold-blooded murder. Trimble's longtime girlfriend, Teresa Hicks, had been trying to leave their troubled relationship. That night, during an argument, Trimble snapped. He shot and killed Teresa in their home, ending her life in a moment of fury. But the violence didn't stop there. Teresa's friend, Rebecca Becky Johnson, and Becky's 7-year-old daughter, Dakota, were also present. In a horrifying turn, Trimble killed them both. The murders of Becky and especially young Dakota shocked the entire community. A child, innocent and defenseless, became a victim of Trimble's rampage. Police quickly arrested Trimble after the murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming: ballistics, witness testimony, and his own admissions. In 2005, a jury convicted him of 3 counts of aggravated murder, and he was sentenced to death. Prosecutors emphasized the particularly cruel and shocking nature of his crimes. Killing a child made the case especially aggravating, ensuring the jury's decision. For more than 20 years, Trimble has sat on Ohio's death row. His appeals challenged the handling of his trial, his mental health, and his representation. But one by one, those appeals were denied. Now the date is set. On March 12, 2026, James Earl Trimble is scheduled to die by lethal injection. What makes his case stand out, even among other capital murders, is the brutality of the victims chosen. Not just a partner in a broken relationship, but her friend who happened to be there, and a child who never had a chance. The story of James Earl Trimble is one that lingers painfully in the memory of Stark County, a reminder of how quickly rage can turn into horror, and how 3 lives, Teresa, Becky, and Dakota, were stolen in a single night. On March 12, 2026, Ohio plans to carry out Trimble's sentence. For the victims' families, it is the end of a decades-long wait. For others, it is yet another reminder of how justice and tragedy intertwine on America's death row. Gerald Robert Hand. The story of Gerald Robert Hand is one of betrayal, manipulation, and calculated violence. At its center are 2 victims, his own wife and a close friend. In 2002, Hand was already on his 4th marriage, living in Franklin County, Ohio. Outwardly, his life looked stable, but prosecutors later revealed a chilling truth. Hand had devised a deadly scheme, one rooted in greed and control. According to the state's case, Hand conspired with his friend, Walter Lonnie Welch, in an arrangement that seemed sinister from the start. Hand's wife, Jill Hand, had a life insurance policy. Investigators alleged that Hand stood to gain from her death. But the scheme did not unfold as planned. On the night of January 15, 2002, Jill was found shot to death inside their home. Shortly afterward, Welch himself was also killed, shot multiple times. Hand claimed Welch had attacked him and his wife, forcing him to act in self-defense. But prosecutors said otherwise. Hand had lured Welch into helping him, then silenced him to cover his tracks. The evidence presented in court was damning. Witnesses described inconsistencies in Hand's story. Investigators uncovered financial motives tied to Jill's insurance. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man willing to sacrifice both his wife and his friend for personal gain. In 2003, a jury convicted Gerald Robert Hand of 2 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. For more than 2 decades, Hand has fought to overturn his sentence. His lawyers challenged the credibility of witnesses, the handling of evidence, and the fairness of the trial. They argued he acted out of fear, not calculation. But one by one, Ohio's courts rejected his appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court also declined to intervene. The long legal battle stretched nearly 24 years, delaying the inevitable, but not preventing it. Now, the countdown has begun. On June 17, 2026, Ohio has scheduled Hand to be executed by lethal injection. At 74 years old, he will be one of the oldest men executed in the state's history. The story of Gerald Robert Hand is one of deep betrayal, of a wife who trusted him and a friend who paid the ultimate price. For years, his case has been tangled in courtroom battles. But now, the final chapter is set. A death sentence carried out in Ohio's prison, ending a story that began with murder and deception in 2002. Cleveland Ramon Jackson. The year was 2002 in Lima, Ohio. A dispute over drugs spiraled into violence, and at the heart of it was Cleveland Ramon Jackson. What made this crime stand out, even in the long history of capital murder cases, was not only the brutality but the victims themselves, 2 young children whose lives ended before they had a chance to begin. According to prosecutors, Jackson went to the apartment of an acquaintance during a drug-related argument. Armed and angry, he opened fire inside the residence. In the chaos, 2 children were killed, 3-year-old Jayla Grant and 17-year-old Lanesha Williams. Several others inside the home, including more children, were injured but survived. The killing shocked the community. Lima, a relatively quiet city, was left reeling by the news that children had been gunned down in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. In 2002, Jackson was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. At trial, witnesses described the carnage inside the apartment, the shots, the panic, the desperate attempts to save the children. A jury found him guilty. The murders of Jayla and Lanesha, both killed in cold blood, convinced the court to impose the harshest sentence. Cleveland Ramon Jackson was sentenced to death. For more than 20 years, Jackson has sat on Ohio's death row. His attorneys filed appeals, arguing about ineffective counsel, issues of evidence, and questions about proportional punishment. But the facts of the case, the deaths of children, always weighed heavily against him. Each legal challenge failed, and one by one, the courts upheld his conviction and sentence. Now, after decades of delays, Ohio has scheduled his execution for July 15, 2026. The state has not officially announced the exact method, but it is expected to be lethal injection, the standard in Ohio's death chamber. For the families of the victims, the execution date represents the end of a painful, decades-long wait. For others, it raises once again the haunting image of children lost to senseless violence. The story of Cleveland Ramon Jackson is one of the most emotionally charged in Ohio's recent history. Two young lives, Jayla, just 3 years old, and Lanesha, only 17, cut down in a storm of bullets. On July 15, 2026, Jackson's own life will be taken by the state, closing a case that has haunted families and community members for more than 2 decades. If you found this video informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more true crime and death row coverage. Which of these upcoming executions stood out to you most? Let us know in the comments below.